Again, it's a 16-week peer-led AI safety research program, and we have 12 mentor projects, which mentees can be a part of. And we'll be spending 16 weeks working on these research projects and aiming for research publications and submitting papers to notable workshops. So today we have the session where we have 4 mentors who are going to present their project ideas, and then we'll have like a Q&A session where you can ask your questions and just discuss and get to know the mentors and their projects. So first up, we have Jeyashree and Ajay. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction of both of them, and then they're going to present their project, which is related to adversarial robustness of protein foundation models. So Jeyashree is a senior machine learning scientist at Siemens, and Ajay is a staff software engineer at Synopsys, and they're both also apart research fellows. So go ahead. You guys have the stage.
Perfect. No, thanks a lot, Aisha. Thanks, Archana, for having us. And so as introduced, the two of us are almost 100% working in an industry role. I work with Siemens and Ajay with Synopsys. And the motivation of this project rather started for us with apart research, where we are heavily investigating on adversarial robustness of genomic foundation models. And the cue for this topic is to kind of transfer some of the analysis that we have begun there to the protein side, and maybe to get the idea started right away. Just give me a second. Yes. So perhaps you guys would have seen in the literature around in the last couple of years, and before, biological foundation models are more widely available, particularly after the ChatGPT moment. So on one side we have the genomic foundation models, such as like DNA-BERT2, nucleotide transformer V2. There is EVO. There's a bunch of different models that's been coming out that are kind of formally or informally used for stuff like sequence classification, kind of identifying regulatory elements or other kind of regression problems, and also it's going in the process where it's used as a component or a phase in biosecurity screening. And on the other side, on the functional side, protein foundation models are also used for function prediction, drug discovery, and so on. And perhaps you guys might have seen and heard that ESM2, 3, and a couple of these other models are also kind of picking up and being heavily used. And many of these models, as you can imagine, are open source, so the weights are available. And if you were to go ahead and check the Hugging Face or GitHub pages of these models, they're downloaded more than 1 million times per month. However, from our knowledge so far in literature review, the adversarial robustness of these models has received somewhat of a off evaluation, for lack of better word, in the sense that we spend a lot of times investigating red teaming against LLMs and so on, but these models are not so have not been fully evaluated. And the concern is also that if these models are deployed in like safety critical pipelines, how robust are they to perturbations? So as motivated before, we have worked on the genomic side of this topic quite a bit now for over half a year or so, and this is shaped up into a couple of papers in the IEEE cybersecurity workshop and journal, as well as the ICLR ML Gen X workshop. And what we want to do is kind of also kick off an analysis on the protein side. So we have divided this talk into 2 parts. The part 1 is like what we have studied so far on the DNA foundation model side, and then the second part is more what we believe we can transfer to the protein side. And just as a heads up, everything that we are presenting today, at least in the part 2, is like our understanding, our first shot at what we can do together, but stuff is always open for discussion. So with that, I will hand over to Ajay for the part 1.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So the idea was essentially, like Jeyashree already described, to see how these genomic foundation models are how they work, and then how easy is it to attack them, assuming that they are going to be used in some classification pipeline. So you could use it in different tasks, so generation tasks, classification tasks. But we said, let's do a simple binary classification problem. And then how can I, how susceptible are these models to attack? So imagine something like you have your classic problem in computer vision. So you have a cat and a dog, you have an image of these things, and then you make a small change in the pixel values, and then the image of a cat, which is obviously a cat for us, with a small change in the pixel values, the model starts predicting it as a dog. So this has been shown to be true. Of course, this in a simple cat dog setting is not so critical, but you can imagine that if, let's say, you were to have such a model running on an autonomous car, it is quite critical that you know how susceptible these things are. And there are some standard methods that are used to attack these models. And you can imagine that essentially your DNA foundation model is like, it's trained on thousands of the ATGC sequences of various animals, so like humans, from viruses, bacteria. So it's trained on thousands of these things and it's essentially like a language of 4 characters. So they have these training done to create a foundation model out of this. So essentially they take in a sequence, so like an ATGC of some size, and then they give you a vector, some embedding vector, from which you train a classifier on top. Now, the thing is, in biology, there are certain biological constraints that are required. So even you cannot just make a random mutation and then say that, yes, there's still biological function preserved. So you need to maintain certain biological plausibility scores. So things like the ratio of the G's and the C's, there are certain sequences that are important, and then they're supposed to maintain them. And then the idea was essentially, can I make the mutations as small as possible? So your epsilon budget for mutations is as small as possible, while I fool my classifier to predict from class A to class B. So that was the motivation. And the third thing being, I still preserve biology, like these constraints, as much as possible. Now, this is essentially like the simplest idea that you can think of. So you take a clean sequence. So you have a sequence of ATGCs. You pass it to a biological foundation model. And for example, it says, is this a promoter, or is this a harmful sequence, or is this not a harmful sequence? It's a very simple case, and it's a black box. So in the sense of, you don't know how the internals of the biological foundation model works. Now, as an attacker, you make one change. So you replace the C with a G. And now this model says, oh, this went from being benign to a promoter, or from harmful to being benign, and so on. Now, how do you know you are supposed to make this? So that's the part of the attacker. So that's the optimizer that runs to say, I picked my smartest change as small as possible to flip the model prediction. So that's what we tried to do before for biological foundation models. And so the setup essentially is that we took 2 models, so DNA BERT and nucleotide transformer. These things have 2 different tokenizers, so they look at different lengths of sequences to make them into tokens. And then for the task, we took the promoter classification data set. So it has 300 sequences of ATGCs, and it's derived from the EPD data set. And then that's on the model and task side. While the attacker is, we took a genetic algorithm. So it essentially takes like the original sequence. We know that this is a promoter. It makes a mutation. Then it asks the model to see, okay, so it makes like 100 different variations. It checks which of them are the best, and then takes the best ones, recombines them, and then does this again. Then you kind of do this 200 generations to figure out which of these adversarial sequences that you generate actually fools the model. And then we started seeing like what happens to these fooled sequences. So what are the properties of these fooled sequences? One of the constraints, like I said, you need to preserve biology in some sense. So what we do is we say, when you make your mutation, there are certain fitness functions and fitness scores that you have to assign. And then there we assign, like, if the GC content ratio is off, then it's a bad one. There are certain motifs, so certain sections of the DNA that you have to preserve. So we know that if this thing doesn't exist, then we know that it's, for example, not a promoter. Then again, you do not allow these changes. And then we did this over many iterations. And then we saw, okay, what happens to these foundation models? And then finally, to kind of close the loop, we generate these adversarial sequences. We go back to the original model and we fine tune them again to see, okay, now this fine tuned model, is it more robust to these kind of attacks? So that was the whole pipeline that we tried so far. And then in a broader scheme of things, where does this all fit in? So the idea is that these foundation models are probably going to be in some screening pipeline, if not now, in the future. Now, what are these screening pipelines? So it's quite common that you can just send a sequence to a sequencing lab and they would synthesize it and send it back to you. Of course, it's on the lab that gets these sequences. It's on them to say, is this a harmful sequence or is this not a harmful sequence? Now, they have various tools in their pipelines, and we expect that going forward, these genomic foundation models would be one of these tools in those pipelines. Now, the idea was, can we get these, or the idea was, is it even safe to use these right now? And that's what we were testing. So for example, in this case, we tested it against classic machine learning models like CatBoost or support vector machines and so on as classifiers for the same problem versus how these genomic foundation models work. Like we said in the beginning, you need a very high classification accuracy and you need a very low attack success rate for in a genomic task for it to be useful as a model. And we see that, for example, most of the classic machine learning models have very low attack success rate, or some of them do, but not so much very high test accuracy, while the genomic foundation models as a baseline have much higher test accuracy, but very high attack success rate. So that means they are vulnerable, but they're quite accurate. But like we said before, if you start adding these adversarial sequences into your training set and you can fine tune them, you can bring down their attack success rate significantly while keeping their accuracy. They still don't hit these numbers that we think are required, but there is promise to show that these foundation models can be used in such a sequencing pipeline. So that's essentially, like we said, so we think these models are like very high accurate, but they're quite brittle. So looking at some of these things, we see like the accuracy is really high, but the attack success rate is also quite high. And then going forward, how do we work on these things in the next steps? So again, this is just more results to show the same thing. So attack success rate goes down, but still it remains quite high to some extent. Finally, one thing that we found out is that the model kind of, or the attacker kind of learns about biology itself. So in our example, the most sensitive regions is in the first half of the sequence, and the model learns that by itself. And also, this is something that we also don't know in terms of biology, why this is true. Certain kinds of transitions are the models are more susceptible to certain kinds of transitions or to transversions. So G to T, for example, is a model is a lot more susceptible, for example, C to T. So these are all the kind of biological implications for why we think these things are quite important. So from there, I would hand it over to Jeyashree again.
Yeah, thank you. So as motivated, we have now kind of heavily tested vulnerabilities across a bunch of genomic foundation models. And what we want to do is to kind of extend or like see how we can extend what we learned to the proteomic space. To our knowledge, one of the most recent papers that directly touch on this is Fan et al., which introduces like a framework called Safe Protein, which is essentially a black box red teaming framework. And what they do is they call as mass recovery task on 429 harmful proteins at 5 generation strategies. So you can see here I have ignored S3 for the moment, but S1 to S5, the 4 strategies across different let's say percentages from 10%, 25, 40, and 50%. And what you find is that with relatively smart strategies such as S5 here, you can go as high as up to 75% attack success rate. Though the ESM3 ships biosafety filtering, it appears that it's insufficient against these attacks. And the overall kind of thread of the paper follows that success is judged exclusively by sequence identity and certain metrics like structural RMST, which we think are proxies, and we could go for slightly different metrics and improve the overall black box attack on one side and see what we can do on the robustness part, which is not the focus of this paper. So yeah, as mentioned in the previous slide, there are 3 things that we want to focus on, but of course we are always open to new ideas and new directions and probably new papers that might have come out since the time Safe Protein came out. The first one is model coverage. The paper almost exclusively, if we're not wrong, focuses on ESM3 open and DPLM2. However, ESM2 is a more widely used open weight protein model, and to our knowledge has not been directly evaluated under this framework. So we want to extend that. And secondly, on proxy evaluation. So like I mentioned, the success metric is about sequence identity and RMSD, which are typically structural proxies. So we don't, that means that it's not typically checked whether the generated protein would fold stably or retain catalytic function. We want to kind of brainstorm here what other evaluation metrics we can use to extend this framework. And third is defenses, right? So here it's a paper focus extremely on the vulnerability, but to our knowledge, no mitigations have been studied. And I think we should also kind of go in the direction that we presented for genomic foundation model, where with iterative training or some different method, you're able to harden the model and be able to also reduce the attack success rate. So we feel like going in any of these directions or all of these directions, like architecture comparison or like improving biological plausibility or improving robustness, would be a really cool direction of research that's not been super explored. So this part is just going through like very first idea that we have. So feel free to also suggest your own and come with questions. The first one is, like I mentioned, extend to ESM2. And the second one is the biological grounded evaluation metrics. These are a couple of new metrics that we came up with that could be useful for us to look into. And the third is, of course, if time permitting and so on, apart from focusing on robustness, we could also extend the study to white box attacks. Of course, a smart guess would be that the success rate would be even higher than 70%, but I think this would also be an avenue where more interesting ideas and questions will open up. So with that, I would like to quickly walk you through like very quick 16-week plan. We have 16 weeks together. The first few weeks will be heavily focused on going through papers, setting up code environment, looking into ESM2. Primarily, the second block or second month will be kind of trying to replicate the safe protein paper and then run the full attack grid with confidence intervals. Then the third phase would be adding our biological evaluation metrics, and then towards the end, looking into the robustness and a couple of other directions, maybe white box attacks as well, and then ideally writing up some form of research, let's say a paper together or an open source benchmark. So to summarize what we take away so far, as we've shown, genomic foundation models can be brittle. Adversarial training reduces the brittleness, but it does not eliminate. Benchmarks typically overstate risk when biological plausibilities relax, so it's very important. And we think protein foundation models may face similar open questions, not exactly, but very similar, and it's probably worth looking into it more in detail. With that, I would like to kind of wrap up the talk. all the papers that we have like kind of shown in the paper are like let's say seed papers to start with, so including the ones that we have worked on, also with the paper safe protein and the others coming from the foundation models. But as mentioned before, we are open to like different ideas that may not be the focus of the stock or adaptations to the stock. Thank you very much for your time. Yeah.
Thanks a lot to both of you for this amazing presentation. Like, it was really thorough. And yeah, the project is super interesting, and I think something that you really need like nowadays. Yeah, so we can see some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to like read them out one by one, and we can answer as many, and then maybe like for the others we can just hop on in the chat. So there's one question: does this research problem assume that we have full access to the model and the weights, or does the analysis of closed source models with a black box setting also is that also a part of the research?
Yeah, so ESM2 is open source. We assume that we have access to weights, but we first focus on black box attacks, so we would not actually exploit that, but we could, as I mentioned, we could extend to white box attacks, right, Ajay?
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the threat models itself is that, let's say there is a company that has a screening pipeline, they probably would not release those models to the public. But let's say you have knowledge of an open source equivalent. So then can you train your adversarial sequences against an open source model and then still fool a closed source model? So that is also a threat vector that we have. So, but the assumption primarily is that you have access to the models. So at least as a research project, you can run this,
Yeah.
but you don't use that knowledge because it's a black box attack. So.
Okay, thanks. Another question: what are some must-have skills you expect the candidate to have?
Yeah, maybe I can take a shot at this, and then Ajay can
Yep.
let us know if you agree. So, I mean, programming skills, as always, ideally now with Claude Code or similar, and maybe like we don't necessarily expect folks to have knowledge on the computational biology side, but being able to read the research papers in that area, or if one member of the team comes with that knowledge, that background, that would be beneficial, but that's not needed at all. What else?
I think primarily that's about it. So can, like, at least at a level of, can read a paper and then more or less identify the computer science parts of it and the biology parts of it. And if there is some knowledge gap in the biology parts, I think we can always reach out to experts to get these things. So that should be okay. But the idea of, I can look at a paper, I can identify the gaps, code this up with some tools, and then work with it. That's primarily what we expect.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. How do you see your evaluation being used during actual drug discoveries using these protein models?
Right. So I think the one of the so one of the genomic foundation models was already used not for drug discovery specifically, but for actually discovering new like more robust crops against certain bacteria. So coming up with new like variations in the genes and introducing these to crops to make them more robust to pests. So there have been cases for using these things already. Specifically for drug discovery, I don't think there is already an existing use case, probably because it's a much more stricter, especially for like human drugs, it's a lot more stricter guidelines and the models are pretty new. So I don't think they're currently being used. But we think that at least there have been cases of people using these models to be able to generate like harmful proteins even. So there is a risk with these models being used in a malicious way. So yeah, that's one of the things. But as of now, they are not being used in drug discovery from our understanding.
Yeah, what we are also seeing is kind of like the models are coming out rapidly, and I mean, if things go the way we think it would go, because these models have very high generative capabilities, it might be included very much in these kind of screening pipelines in the future, because we are basically still catching up to the models as is right now. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, on a different note, if biological constraints are to be preserved, are there existing biological informed models similar to physics informed models, PINNs? If not, could the research lead to possible PINNs?
Right. So there are certain biologically informed neural networks. So like how you have PINNs, then there are also like BINNs, so the equivalent ones, but they work in a different fashion. So they are not foundation models. So in this case, this is explicitly like a foundation model, which is in some sense trained agnostically. So there isn't an explicit biological constraint that is added to it. So you essentially have these huge databases of sequences, and then you just train your foundation model on top. So biological constraints are implicitly added to the foundation model, but not something that's explicit. For us, we add these biological constraints because we look at adversarial sequences. So there's no guarantee that an adversarial sequence still follows any kind of biological constraint. So the biological constraints that we add are explicitly added because we are trying to generate adversarial sequences.
So because this is a black box attack, the plausibility here is largely referring to the plausibility being preserved in the data set that we pollute, basically.
And got nothing to do with the plausibility of plausibility being preserved in the model, because that comes implicitly through the data that it's trained on.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question is, your closing point was plausible may not mean safe. Do you think the field now needs function level verification rather than mostly structural or plausibility based evaluation to make robustness claims meaningful?
Exactly. So that's a very good question. So we have felt working on the genomic space that we are learning a lot, but the functionality is rather directly, like it's very hard to infer it directly, which is why we also want to extend this work to protein foundation models. So here, hopefully, we are able to attack these sequences, preserving biological plausibility, and be able to measure whether the functionality is preserved or not, which makes a huge difference, I would say, right?
Right. So with one of the drawbacks of our current work is that it's hard to measure functionality easily because we looked at non-coding regions. So they don't become proteins. They're just like DNA sequences. But now we want to look at protein sequences, which means there is a function downstream. And then I think like the question already asked, so do you need to look just at structural or at functional? So if there is a computational way for us to look at just functional, then preserving the functional aspects is the best thing. But there is no easy way to directly measure functionality of a adversarial protein. So we need to come up with proxies. And one of the proxies for us was biological plausibility, however we measure it. So if you have a way to measure function, great. If you have a way to measure structure, that's also biological plausibility for us to maintain.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so just two more questions. We can just have these two. So there's one. When we harden these models with adversarial training, do we see a trade-off where they actually get worse at their standard biological predictions?
So maybe I could go back to the relevant graph, just a second. So for the genomic foundation models, as you can see with it, like with 5 or 6 iterations, you are able to kind of halve the attack success rate from 40% to 20%. I don't think we have noticed any corresponding loss in functionality or something of this sort, right? Yeah.
So these are two attack methods that we tried. So this was the genetic algorithm. For example, you see that it went from about 40% attack success rate to roughly 20 to 30% attack success rate, while the test accuracy remains pretty clean and still remains stable. A second attack method that we tried was this is even random flips. So this is not even an optimizer. This is a super simple random flip model. In this case, also we see like we have an even higher test accuracy. So because we ran through a few optimizations also in the testing, so you see that it's about 90% accuracy and it's like 89.8% accuracy. So the test accuracy remains quite stable. while the attack success rate can be reduced. So hopefully this answers the question that you still preserve clean test accuracy while your attack
Hardly
success
some
rate
more.
goes down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah, so just one last question. What's your mentorship style?
Oh, that's a good one. I guess we are figuring it out, and it's always unique to every project. But maybe I think we are doing a couple of these things in other projects as well. Ours at least I would say is an open style in the sense that at least I prefer that the mentees are like able to think critically and bring their own hypotheses, bring their own directions. Could be right or wrong. We evaluate it together, but that's one thing I would add. The second is if there are any issues or problems or stuff like this, at least I always prefer if we have open conversations early on so that we can always figure things out together. What else do I add? Do you have?
Yeah, I think that's about it. So basically, if there's a blocker, then and if it's a blocker that we could resolve, or if there is any blocker, we come to us as quickly as possible so that that's resolved. And then in terms of like the scientific ideas, I think we're pretty open to or we actually would prefer if the ideas come from the mentees rather than from us telling, hey, this is my idea, please implement this thing. I think it's best if they come up with and say, hey, I think this is cool. The idea for us is probably to say, I can give context to see maybe this is the direction to go, or maybe this is not the direction to go. And secondly, if this is something that we don't know about as well, our goal is to find out who's the best person who knows this and then try and get there.
And what I also really appreciate if the mentees are very structured, they're able to kind of independently bring meeting notes and be able to walk through individual points that they have issues with, that you can go back and forth, or any other challenges that they may have, like setting up cluster or stuff like this. We can go through it together, but really it's more driven by them, and then we try to facilitate as many things as possible from our side. That would be cool, but of course it's always like you figure things out.
If required to be more hands-on, we are always open.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. I think that's also what PRISM itself, what we aim for, this peer-led kind of aim. Okay, so I think I think I see a few more questions in the chat. So if you guys want to hang around, you can directly answer the other questions in the chat if you guys want to hang around. Yeah.
We could do this.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for presenting. Okay, so now we have the next mentor, Jobst. So we'll give a quick intro while Jobst, you can share your screen in the meantime. So Jobst is a senior scientist and a group lead at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And so this project is focused on grounding safe by design AI. Yeah, excited to have you here.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this. There's so many people here on the call. I'm a bit nervous. Can you hear me well? And can you see my slides without much distraction? I'm always unsure whether you can see this Zoom control stuff in my shared screen or whether you cannot. Can you?
Yeah, we can see that. I think there's option to kind of minimize it or close it so you can.
Maybe I just close the chat, so make it small so that it's going away. Okay, so this project is in many ways very different, and I think that's good because you have choice. So this project is not domain specific; it's very domain agnostic, and it's more related to what you might call AGI safety, the safety of agents that could do all kinds of stuff. That we might have in the near future. And it is related to my overall research agenda that I will tell you a little bit about before telling you what the actual small project is about.
Really sorry for interrupting, but your screen seems to be stuck, and we can also see the controls. Could you try to reshare it once again?
I haven't changed the slide yet, so if you still see the first slide, that's perfectly correct. Now you see the second slide?
No, yeah, I think it's actually stuck. Because you
Okay,
can see the first slide and then a bunch of zoom controls. So I think that's
I hadn't moved on with the slides, so but I'm happy to share. So that now you see a different slide?
Yes.
Okay,
Now,
very good.
yes, now the
Okay,
controls.
so
Very good. Thank you.
about the motivation. So I want to start with two quotations by Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate from the 90s. And because my project is mostly about freedom or liberty or power empowerment, the first quotation is, expansion of freedom is viewed in this approach, his approach, both as the primary end and as the principal means of development. Development consists of the removal of various types of unfreedoms that leave people with little choice and little opportunity of exercising their reasoned agency. So this is the objective of my agenda is the removal of various types of unfreedoms, because I believe most risks that emerge from AI have to do with some form of disempowerment of people. So this is what this project is about. And the second quotation is, if a theory of justice, that's what he was working on, is to guide reasoned choice or of policies, or by analogy, guide choice by AI systems, then the identification of fully just social arrangements, like in an optimization type of way, is neither necessary nor sufficient. And that points to optimization maybe not being the right framework. And I'm saying this because much of the AI field is still focused on optimizing whatever and trying to figure out what should be optimized. And I think that's the wrong approach. So this is just as a motivating thing to get kind of the a little bit you in the mode. And so this project is about empowerment or power or agency. There's a lot of different words that are related in some sense and that I think are very important for AI safety. Why do I think this? Because AI risk, I think, is mostly really about power. We might have a power-seeking rogue AI that just grabs power eventually and overturns the government and whatsoever. That's a kind of the classical worry. But maybe we just hand over power voluntarily, in a gradual way. That seems to be happening already. Like we're automating so many things where rather than thinking on our own, we're asking Claude to do it for us. And that's just as much of a risk. And then, of course, there's also this global race for AI, which is also about power. So everything seems to be about power. And I want to compare my approach a little bit with approaches put forward by some other people. For example, in this Paris conference in last year and this year in January, there's, for example, Joseph Stiglitz, the economics Nobel Prize winner, who's mostly putting forward fair trade, for example. That's what he's known for. And he says we must ensure that AI isn't augmenting labor rather than replacing labor. And so this is also about who has the control in the workplace. Is it the worker who uses the AI, or is it the AI that just tells everyone what to do? And then there's Stuart Russell, who is kind of known for his basic textbook thing that everyone reads on AI. And he says we should not have AI optimize for something fixed. We should rather have it learn and update what the objective actually is by observing humans and trying to learn from them what they want. He calls it existence games. Then there's Max Tegmark, who says maybe we shouldn't build such agentic systems at all because they tend to be power seeking. We should keep them to be tools, maybe domain specific tools. And there's Yoshua Benjo, who says, yeah, we really shouldn't build any agents, not even tool specific. We should only build AI systems that serve as something like an oracle that can answer questions about the real world rather than making recommendations. He calls this scientist AI. So there's all these approaches around. And then most recently, Geoffrey Hinton said, maybe the AI might be an agent, or maybe we cannot even prevent it to be an agent, but maybe then it should have motherly instincts and kind of love us and protect us and so on. I find this a little bit creepy, but this is another position. And now, what is common to all of those? It's that the AI system shouldn't just maximize some form of utility function. That's kind of common to all of them. So the question is, what else can we do? And so my approach is the idea to have an AI agent, a general AI agent that tries to empower people, basically everyone. Of course, there's trade-offs, so it's kind of aggregate empowerment, and that is the idea, not to maximize utility, but just to empower people, keep them in control, leave them able to achieve what they want. So the key idea here is to structure on some form of power that is formalizable, so that we can reason about it and maybe instill it in a decision rule, and it's kind of structural, therefore. And the core idea of the project is how many potential goals, whatever they are, people want different things, can a human achieve, and how well can they do that? Given a certain situation, their options and their beliefs and so on, and the level of rationality they have, and the likely behavior of others and the environment. So that's the larger agenda that I have. And I've thought about this quite some while, and I believe such an agent would show a number of nice emergent behaviors that we like. It would provide information, it would kind of extend the menu of things that people can do, but it would also overwhelm them because they're boundedly rational. It would ask for confirmation before it takes an irreversible action. It would make binding commitments so that people know what it will do if they, for example, press a certain button or say a certain word. Will avoid irreversible change, protect people from harm, because if they're harmed, then they have fewer things they can do, and unblock them by removing obstacles, and so on and so on. All kinds of nice things. And we also perform some first simulations, where, for example, in such a simple grid world here, a robot is just tasked to empower a human that it has no idea what the human wants. The robot is just thinking, oh, maybe the human want to walk somewhere, and there's a door that's just locked, and what the robot then learns to do is to unlock the door and get out of the way so that the human can reach more different goals. And that happens without the robot ever worrying about what the actual goal of the human really is. So it's really not trying to help them achieving their actual goal, but rather enabling them to reach whatever goals. So that's kind of the wider project, and it is somewhere in the middle of all these other projects. And now, looking at this picture, I feel like I have to make one comment. You see, all these people are old white males, and I think this is really bad for the whole community of AI safety. We really need way more diversity in all kinds of ways, and that's why I'm so happy that PRISM also kind of focuses on that a little bit and tries to increase the diversity. I mean, I'm an old white male as well. I can't help it in a sense, and but I'm very happy to work with people who are not old white males. So okay, that was my disclaimer here. Before I go on to the actual project, I want to also shamelessly advert a number of funny plays and novels that I had Claude written last year, which relate to all these different approaches there, and which you might want to read. So if you want, then just scan this QR code or open it later when I share the slides. So now let's go a little bit more into detail what I actually propose. So this might have sounded all nice, but you might worry, how can we achieve this? How can we form such an agent that empowers people? And I believe we should follow a safe by design approach, which is very different from the current LLM monolithic approach, where you basically have a big, not very well understood blob in the middle that contains knowledge about the world, contains preferences, goals, and takes actions by writing text and then using tools that are connected to it. This kind of current paradigm, I think, can never be made sufficiently safe when we think of AGI. And then there is this community that's pursuing or promoting a safe by design approach, which typically is way more modular. And one idea there is to separate the agency, so the decision-making part, from the intelligence. And one way to do that is the one that I kind of try to study, and that consists of basically three components. There is a very big learned world model that knows a lot about the world, has learned how the world works. It can predict the consequences of possible actions. And that might be an LLM or other foundational model, or might be a very big Bayesian network or something like that. Trained, learned, not too easy to analyze, not too easy to reason about. That's kind of the thing that is closest to what we have now, but its purpose is not to take action, but to just serve as an oracle for answering questions about the real world, similar to what Yoshua Bengio proposes. And then there's certain metrics that we want to estimate, like power metrics, like how much power people have when we take certain actions. And these can be computed or estimated by powerful algorithms that extract knowledge from the world model, ask it several questions, and try to estimate quantities such as power, information gain of actions, and so on. Indicators of things that then finally the decision rule can use to make decisions. And this part here really should be a hardwired rule that we have written, that we have reasoned about, where we really know what it is doing with the information provided by the other components. And that could be, for example, we're picking actions that we think are not decreasing the estimated human power, and among all those, increase the information gain. But this is just one version of such a decision rule. Okay, so this was the overall project. There's some literature on the decision rule that I've published. There's something about the approximation algorithm, but that's not the part of this project. This project is more about what the world model is and where it might come from. Because such a world model could be really different kinds of things. It could be a general simulation model of everything that might matter in the sense of a digital twin or a generative AI-based thing such as Sora or Genie or so on. But that wouldn't be really easy to use for planning and reasoning. It can be used for rolling out simulations, but not so easy for reasoning. Or planning. So I think it should rather be a predictive model of possible consequences of currently relevant actions in currently relevant possible states, and thereby it's situational, small enough so that we can use it for actual decision making. So that's a different thing. And more formally, what could it be? It could be a stochastic game with a finite number of states and action and so on. What's a stochastic game? It's basically a multi-agent version of a Markov decision process. And why multi-agent? Because it's not about the AI only, it's also about the humans that the AI interacts with. So it needs to model what they might do if they have certain goals and how that interacts. That is very, very valuable for theory, this type of structure, and almost all the sequential decision-making theory nowadays uses stochastic games as the data structure. It's also okay if you learn, like reinforcement learning and so on. But in realistic situations, this can get large very fast because there's many, many different possible states. Even in a game such as tic-tac-toe, you already have like 5,000 different possible states and so on. And that's almost trivial situation. So it is kind of challenging for planning. There's alternative ways of formalizing planning model. And one of them is PDDL. That is a formal language used in industrial planning, for example. And that's more condensed and structured, but also it's a little bit less flexible. And then there's hierarchical models of those or combinations of those. And arguably, we as humans, when we plan, then we're using a hierarchical model. We're first making long-term decisions, and we zoom in and make smaller step decisions, and then we zoom in again, and then once we get to a level where we decide which key on the keyboard to press. So this it is not clear where they come from and which of them we should use. So this is what this project is about. The research question of this project, this is almost the last slide, is when this MPO agent has to make a decision, how can it use an LLM or other type of foundation model to produce a predictive situational model that is small enough for its approximation algorithms to estimate the human power metrics it needs, to decide how empowering its possible actions could be. So if you imagine these three-step thing, there's a world model, there's approximation algorithms, and then there's the decision rule. The world model needs to be simple enough so that the algorithms can actually use it for planning. And so where could those situational model comes from? And one idea is really to just have an LLM make them on the fly, just in time. And some questions, of course, are then what model type? Should it be a stochastic game, a PDDL, some hierarchy, some combination? And then how do we prompt them from the LLM? What strategy? Is it just a single prompt? Is it step by step? Do we have some review phases back and forth and so on? Just a very, very simple example I just produced an hour ago by asking Claude, please give me a JSON file that encodes the stochastic, as an interesting stochastic game between Alice and Bob, where it is about negotiating something. And this is what it came up with. So it structured this JSON file by saying what the players are, what the possible states are, where we start, what the possible actions are in the different states, and what the consequences are of taking particular action combinations in particular states. Like, for example, if they're in the trusting stage and Alice does the withhold action and Bob does the share option, then they will reach a deal with 40% probability and no deal with 60% probability. So these numbers are the predicted probabilities that Claude thinks are true in this sense. So this is, of course, a minimal example of what we might head for. In the end, it will rather have thousands of states, maybe. So it's not clear how to produce that with a single prompt. This is what the project is about. So what you should come up with to work on this is mostly experience in prompt engineering, because it's mostly about prompt engineering. And then, of course, to orchestrate the whole thing, you need Python coding experience. And because the thing produced by the LLM is probably something like a JSON data structure, you should know about those. And it might be an MDP or stochastic game, then it couldn't hurt to know about MDPs a little bit or other types of simple formal models. So this is basically what I hope you could bring. And what can I bring? I have a lot of theory about modeling, the EMPRO approach, AI safety more generally. I work in a complexity science department and so on. I can provide some test scenarios and mostly, of course, mentoring about methodology. I give honest feedback typically. And if you get stuck, I also provide ideas. I try to not do that too early because I want you to have the ideas, but I do have ideas, and so I'm happy to provide them. And then there's also a larger EMPRO project, which I work on with some other type of teams in other programs like Safe AI Germany and AI Safety Initiative Groningen and PIPS, and they work on other aspects of the overall projects, like, for example, reinforcement learning and so on. Okay, so that was my pitch.
Okay, thank you so much. This is one very extremely interesting project, and yeah, again, something that is super relevant to today's AI safety landscape. So we have a few questions in the chat. I'm going to go through them one by one. So there's this question, kind of detailed. So do you plan to borrow from psychological or neuroscientific ideas to design safe AI? For example, ideas like the ego, the conscious brain that possesses a third-person understanding of its consciousness and reasoning that can be understood and enhanced. Maybe AI development needs a similar architecture.
Not in this project. This project really is about this particular aspect of my overall agenda, like how to make these situational models. In the wider context of the project, this might be relevant, of course. However, in the Safe by Design community, the question is not so much what is intelligence or how do intelligent agents evolve. The question is really like, how should we design AI systems so that they are safe? So it's more a design approach than an empirical approach about learning from humans or something like that. But of course, the boundary is a little bit fuzzy.
Okay.
It's not like I'm not interested in that question. I just don't see the direct connection.
Yeah, it's like your project is scoped a bit differently, even though the landscape kind of makes sense. So there's another kind of related question. So adding to the same question, someone has said, will philosophy also be relevant?
Philosophy is always relevant in all of AI safety because eventually this is an ethical question, right? Eventually question is, what should an AI system do? And that's a normative ethical question. So in the wider project, this is I'm very much engaging with philosophers all the time. For this particular project, again, I don't think so much, more like a motivational thing. So the particular PRISM project is really more like a technical project. How can we extract this thing from the AI, from an LLM? But in terms of motivation and the wider context, very much.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, another question. Do you think we can ever really build morality into AI? At the end of the day, I just does what we wanted to do, but human nature itself can't exactly be consistent or isn't exactly consistent or perfect. So wouldn't AI just end up reflecting that? That's the question.
I think the question is similar to the first. So that's the very point of the safe by design thing and separating the agency from the intelligence. I strongly believe we must not have the behavior emerge from some kind of learning or training or whatever, or evolutionary process. We must control the decision making as good as possible. We must instill it by writing the decision rule as code. And only the thing that informs the decision rule, like the predictions of what would happen and so on, that might be learned or so then we can prevent the AI to having goals other than the ones we wanted to have.
Okay, makes sense. All right. Another question is, what sort of evaluation can be used for the generated model, and what type of conference would this be suitable for?
That's a very, very good question. I think what sort of evaluation can be used is part of the first phase of the project because it's less trivial than if you have a classical machine learning problem where you have some kind of ground truth that you can compare the result with. It's not, most of the time, it's not clear what the ground truth could be. Of course, we can start with things like, for example, simple games like tic-tac-toe, where we know what the ground truth is because we know the rules of the game and we can compare the output whether it has represented the rules correctly or not. So that we can do with very simple things, but with more interesting and more relevant situations, we have probably to rely on some other evaluation methodology, and it's part of the project to come up with that methodology. It might be a subjective thing. It might also be plugging it into my wider decision algorithm and see what the agent that uses this model actually does and see whether it kind of does something strange because something is missing in the model. So that's kind of less trivial than in other projects to evaluate it. And regarding the consequences, I think if it works, kind of, there is both a planning community conferences that we could kind of send this to or submit it to, but also general machine learning consequences because the technique we use is about LLMs and prompting, and that is a kind of a common thing that is represented in many of the major AI conferences. So I'm confident we will find some outlet.
Yeah, like this is a strong candidate for conferences like NeurIPS and
I think so, yeah. I hope so, at least.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions, so let's take like a couple more. So how are you thinking about preserving the important real-world factors when an LLM compresses a situation into a smaller planning model, like JSON or stochastic game or PDDL? It feels like the abstraction layer itself could become the biggest hidden failure point.
So is this about the coarseness of the model? I guess it's like that, right? That much is lost when we just boil everything down to a model with just a few thousand states. I take this question to be about that. So yeah, that's a problem. And that's why I think eventually the system needs to use a hierarchy of models. So the idea is it has a first model that has kind of maybe thousands of nodes, states, which are it's just tractable to perform planning, and then select some action in that thing, and then it has to zoom in and see what that is really, and it has to refine the model, kind of make it more detailed, but also restrict it to what it has already decided. So I think this kind of managing the level of detail and the abstraction, that is really only really tractably solvable by using a hierarchical approach. And I believe that's what humans do as well. I'm not sure that was what the question was about. I hope so.
No, I think that's exactly like what the question was. I believe what it was asking. Okay. So one last question that we can take. I have NLP and LLM research background. How much maths? How much there is like rigorous maths needed for this project?
I don't think we need any. You need any math. You need to understand what JSON files are. You need to understand what a Markov decision process is. You don't need any formal math stuff. Not even about sequential decision making so much. It's really about extracting these formal representations of situations and what could happen in these situations. So I guess the background needed is really not that complicated. It's mostly really prompt engineering and so on.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we have a bunch more questions, but yeah, so since we have to like limited time, so if you want, you can like stay back, and if you want, you could just answer some of those in the chat, and yeah.
Yeah, I'll do so.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your attention.
All right, so now we have the next mentor, Branwen. So to give a bit of a background for Branwen. Meanwhile, Branwen, you could like start sharing your screen. So Branwen is a research fellow at Arcadia Impact and an epidemiologist by training. And she has some work published in Nature Medicine. So Branwen's project is kind of centered around like applying I'm sorry, this is a bit difficult to pronounce, but applying epidemiological methods to AI harm monitoring. And it's centered around kind of biosecurity. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides. I do have a very nice website to show you, which I'll just leave here and then talk about it in a minute. So this project is about the question of how we should be monitoring AI harms. The literature is very clear that people who work in AI harms monitoring really want there to be a system, want there to be standards, want there to be methods, but there is no there are very few methods. There's no real agreement. That's just very clear, right? That we have no way of monitoring AI harms at the moment. There is lots of urgency about this, not just because we need to monitor AI harms, but also there are also deadlines because the EU AI Act will be coming into force and will need methods for monitoring AI harms, and the OECD are also having conversations, and both of those things are happening this year. So like it's urgent both in terms of need and in terms of like actual real world deadlines. So the state of the art at the moment for monitoring AI harms is basically databases with raw counts. So there are a few different databases. The OECD have a database where they systematically collect publicly available reports of AI harms, and then there are a few others. The AI incident database, which is AIID, which also does the same sort of thing basically. But there are a few different databases. Some of them have different focuses. Some of them are sort of general, and what is lacking is a vision of what to do with these raw counts. All right, so it's just sort of just to kind of count how many bad things are happening in the world, but like okay, how do we contextualize these numbers? What do we do with it? There are different lenses that you can use to look at like monitoring risks and monitoring events. One of them would be like the aviation lens. So that would be like when a plane goes down, or when anything bad happens on a plane, there is a process, right? You look through and the whole system is examined, and the conclusion to the process can never just be it was pilot error, right? So some people have been talking about that as a possible lens through which to look at AI harms. And then there's this sort of newly developing approach, which is to use a public health lens to look at AI harms, and which is kind of where I come in, I guess. So I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. So public health has lots of ways of examining the sort of diffuse, like society things that are going on in society, whether you can see them or not, that are sort of here, there, and everywhere, and which you can draw parallels to AI use and also AI harms. I've been working on a project at Arcadia Impact, which applies this sort of public health lens to AI harm monitoring, to try to develop a methodology for monitoring AI harms. I don't know how many times I can say AI harms in 5 minutes, but I'm going for a record. So we're working with the one of these databases, which is the AI incident database, which is based at MIT. And we've come up with what I consider to be a very bare bones methodology. Like there's really, like, I can't emphasize enough. There is a whole methodology and a whole system of monitoring that needs to be built. Like at the moment, there's only databases. Now we're sort of developing a very, very basic, minimal methodology to start working with the database. But over the next few years, we really need to sort of ramp up how we're thinking about like systematically monitoring AI harms. So now I will talk about the website, I think. So this is a nice website. I'll send you the link. Can you see? You can only see my screen, right? You can't see yourselves. I am like Jobst, and I don't know how much of the Zoom is interfering with what you can see.
No, it's all good. We can see the website.
It's fine. It's fine. Okay. All right. So this is basically a plot of incidents, so harms recorded in the AI incident database over time, and you can see that it's increasing, and there could be lots of reasons for this increase. One of them, of course, is that AI is getting more dangerous and causing more harm. One of them could be that reporting is increasing, which is also probably the case. People are getting more concerned. And another one could be that AI is not getting more dangerous as such, but people are just using it a lot more. Right, so there's only so much you can tell from raw counts. So our methodology starts off by asking a very defined monitoring question. So which I can show you in a bit if you want. Basically, where you really think through carefully what harm it is that you're interested in what population and over what time frame. And the point of this is to really define, before you start counting, to really define what it is that you're counting, and to be very explicit about it. And then we start with the counting. We measure harm in two ways. So one is to go into the database. In this case, we use the AIID database, but could be other databases, and get raw counts from there. To produce a sort of like the lowest possible threshold, I suppose. And then we go and look at real world data. We make assumptions. We use proxy data, whatever we can use to come up with a best estimate of harm. So we have this lowest bound, and then we have sort of let's call it a best estimate of harm. And then we do a similar thing with exposure. So we also want to measure how much this particular AI is being used, or how many people have exposure to it, or whatever. And we measure, so we also use proxy measures for that. And we measure both the harm and the exposure over at least 2 time points, so that we have some sort of time. So because the point is to measure it over time. And then we assign it a classification. So we end up with, we put our harm in one of these 4 boxes, basically. So and it's depending on whether the harm is increasing depending on the movement of the direction of the harm and of the exposure. So if both are increasing, if both the harm and the exposure are increasing, we call it escalating. So in this case, for example, we looked at suicidality and LLM use, and we found that both the harm, like both suicides or suicidal ideation, and the exposure, like the exposure being using LLMs to discuss personal problems or discuss mental health, are both increasing. We have this box called mitigating, which is probably, we'll eventually find a better word. But anyway, it's when like the harms are decreasing or staying the same, but exposure is increasing a lot. And for that, we have the example of automated vehicles. So the automated vehicles have increased immensely over the past year or two, but the harms are pretty much stabling off. And we haven't actually found any concentrating or receding ones where not that I can think of. So that's sort of the overview of our methodology. And what does it mean for this? Hang on a second, I'm looking at my notes. Okay, so the question for this fellowship is like, can this process be reliably automated? Not that it always should be automated. I mean, I think humans should be involved, but sometimes you want things to be automated. So at the moment, this classification process takes the good part of an afternoon. I would say, at a minimum, before you sort of have something that you're happy with. You could also take a whole PhD. I think you could also like spend years classifying one thing. But I would say at a minimum, it takes 2 or 3 hours. So yeah, so so in this project, the question would be, can acquire of agents or whatever system you want to come up with, can it reliably as a human manually doing this process, or as reliably as the opinion of an expert? Can it end up in the same box? Like, it doesn't have to be the same numbers, it doesn't have to be the same process, but can it reliably identify that something that we consider to be escalating is actually escalating, or something that we consider to be receding is actually receding? And I would say that there are 2 steps, probably in a bit of an iterative process. One is to develop the automation system, and the other is to test it, how well it's going against both the manual process and against expert opinion. So the output, I would say, for this project would be to publish it. I think it would be a very good publication, and it would contribute to this urgent discussion that's going on at the moment. And I suspect that it would probably be adapted, or even just straight up adopted by the AI incident database at MIT. So they're very enthusiastic. We have not even finished our paper, really. There is a draft that's been floating around for like 10 days or so of our methodology. And just to give you an example of how like hungry people are for a methodology, and hungry for like, yeah, we need to work out how to monitor this, how to monitor AI harms. Someone at MIT like took our paper and made this nice website, like, and just sent it to us on Wednesday. And we have not even finished the paper, right? That's what I want to say. And I was very relieved, because I didn't want to make slides for this presentation. And then I got the website and I was like, okay, fine. I can use that. So what sort of, to the question of like what sort of people this project needs, it would be I would say people who like to automate things, for sure, in whatever method you want. I honestly don't have opinions about this, and sort of just people who are open to ambiguity, because there is no way of counting AI harms. It's kind of impossible. There is no real way of counting how exposed people are to AI harms. And there's no real way of monitoring all of this. Like, we're all just making this up as we go along, while being very explicit about assumptions and very explicit about limitations. So yeah, like it's this this project is suitable for people who want to automate things, try out things, and be very explicit about what it is that they're doing. And I'll share now this website in the chat.
Okay, thanks a lot, Branwen. That is super interesting. Something like a lot of new stuff that I learned today from the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to now read out some of the questions that we have. By the way, I accidentally dropped off the meeting, so I cannot see some of the past questions. So Archana, if you're there, can you hop in and read those out that I miss out?
Yes, can do that. 1 sec, sorry, our chat is filled with questions on top of each other, so we might have to wait till I find the first question here. Oh, I think I found the first one. So is the database and the analysis of incidents going to be focused on primarily the mental health effects or the incidents that involve crimes using AI? For example, the physical self-harms can be described as the next stage of deteriorating mental health, but are we referring harms to health incidents or the activities like deepfakes or other events that drive towards that?
Yeah, no, and it's not at all limited to health. No. So when I say public health lens, I don't mean that we're interested in health particularly. Just more that just to sort of use the ways of thinking of public health, that how do we deal with uncertainty, basically? Because that's what public health deals with, is just immense uncertainty of how to measure things that are happening in society. Yeah, so no, not at all. Not limited to any AI harm in particular.
Okay, awesome. The next question that we have here is
There's something about a zero-shot classification model.
yeah, I
I
think
don't know what a zero-shot classification model is.
I think it's like prompting it just once for classification, but correct me if I'm wrong, Aisha.
Yeah, I
Zero
think
shot classification.
zero shot, I think, means you don't give any sort of examples and you just give it the classification task and it's supposed to just classify.
Okay.
Yeah, so the question is, I think it would be nice to provide zero-shot classification model to assist humans to make the process faster and easier, considering, agentic
Mhm.
AI integration can help building an automated platform for this use. I think it was more of a comment, but
Okay,
still.
okay. Yeah, no, that's I will
Yeah. Other question we have here
I
is
will
when
look
you
into zero.
say, yes. Yeah, when you say automate things, what do you mean? Are you looking at a software or a pipeline as the end product?
I guess a pipeline. So this is not my field at all, right? I have to emphasize this. So when I say automate, I'm not sure what I mean, but it should be I think the minimum that it should be is a proof of concept that that the process could be automated, like that.
I believe that is kind of essentially a pipeline, I think.
I mean, I think it's I think it's a pipeline, yeah.
Okay. Okay, another question we have is, what's your mentorship style?
What's my mentorship style? Well, I think for this project it might be a bit different because because I don't know how to automate it, I suppose. I also don't think it's very complicated, but let's see. So in that case, I have few opinions, I suppose. My research taste is that I like things to be very very clearly defined. But I suppose that's
You
what
will
research says.
Because
My mentor style is that I like to I like people to come with ideas, and I ask questions to make sure that they've thought everything through. I really for me, one of the most important things is that the end product is clear and well documented and well written in a way that people actually don't mind reading it. Because that's what you take into the world, and something can only be used if people actually, engage with it. So I would say that my emphasis is more like is in the end product and making that useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, another question is, do you think expert equivalent classification is enough for deployment, even if the system reaches a result through a different reasoning path than humans?
Sorry, I didn't. Oh, okay, now I can see it now. Do I think an expert equivalent classification is enough for deployment? I mean, I don't know. Of course not. No. Like once we develop this thing, should we just sit back and let an AI agent decide whether or not we're suffering from AI harms? No, absolutely not. But it can sort of hum along in the background, I would say. And yeah, it should be a help, and certainly not. Certainly will never ever, should never ever be sufficient.
Yeah, there should be like always an aspect of a human in the loop there.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Okay, one last question. But in some cases, the events drive the harms, and in some cases, the harms actually drive the events. So what exactly is the focus of the analysis? Automation works seamlessly without human intervention when a focus is defined.
I'm not sure what an event is in this case. For me, so if an event is an incident, then I would say an incident is the harm. I'm not.
I think maybe the way I interpret it is when it comes to, maybe if we look at it in the light of harmful element responses, then some harmful responses come from the context that the LLM is given. So maybe that context is kind of an event. Itself has a propensity to induce harmful responses. So that is one case. And then the other case is maybe a harmful response from the LLM kind of drives some unlikely or undesirable kind of event. That's the way I interpret it. Kind of like cyclic sort of thing, maybe.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that well, I didn't dwell on it perhaps enough, but the start of the process should be defining a monitoring question. So when you really define very narrowly what it is, what counts as a harm, and in what population or in what whatever you're interested in, and over what time. So I think that we would never be mixing the event and the harm, because in one automation process because it's defined in the monitoring question.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, just one last question, and then after that we can end the session. So given that exposure estimation seems to be the binding constraint on classification quality, what proxy data sources are you currently finding most usable across different monitoring questions?
Sorry, for exposure, was that? I was just trying to look for the question. It's for exposure. So given the
Let me paste it again.
no, I found it now. Thank you. Well, one of the problems we have actually, we haven't tried so many monitoring questions. We've only tried about 8 in total, and half of them have flat exposures. So we end up sort of like because exposure didn't change over time, because what we're basically looking at is a group of people. So like people with telephones or a certain demographic group. And in that case, yeah, we're basically losing we're losing half of the dynamism of the question. So exposure estimates. So what proxy data sources are we finding reusable? Just like estimates of population, I would say. And otherwise, it comes from survey data. So it could be LLM use for a particular for a particular thing. And if we have survey data over the timeframes that we're interested in, then we can apply that to the population. What else? Yeah, it's mainly survey data, I would say.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much. That was our last question. So thank you so much for taking out the time. And yeah, thank you, and also Jobst again, the other two mentors and TNU. But yeah, we're like super excited for all of these projects and see what comes out of these. And personally, also excited to see how it all goes and hopefully be an active part of these projects as well. So yeah, I think this is about it, and yeah, in conclude the session. Okay, so thank you so much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Bye.